Good evening, everyone. Thank you for spending a few minutes of your Thursday evening with me here while I talk for a few minutes about my most recent book, Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas from 1914 until 1965. And I guess I'll tell you a little bit about how I started with this book. I had written a book on South Carolina, which is my home state. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina originally. And in that book, I wrote about a woman who was a civil rights activist who also happened to be a home demonstration agent. And I didn't have the time at that point to really investigate what that was, but something told me that, well, you're living in Arkansas, um, find out what that is when you have an opportunity. And I did. I started nosing around. I wanted to find out what a home demonstration agent was. I never heard of the Agricultural Extension Service, any of those sort of things. So I just started doing some research on that. And then I happened upon someone who had written a book about the Extension Service in Arkansas. And I read the book and I barely saw any mentions about Black women in there, a couple, but not really. And then I asked the woman who wrote the book about it. And I said, well, tell me more about these Black agents. And she just sort of very dismissively said, oh, well, they did the same thing as the white agents. And I thought, if you're talking about these women in this period between 1915 and 1965, that's just not true. So that's sort of where this began. I wanted to know more. I knew intuitively that there was more to their story than just doing the same thing as white agents. That just wasn't possible in the rural Jim Crow South at that point. I also wanted to write a book that talks about the ways Black people who chose to remain in the South made sense out of life there and how they built prosperous lives and to tell a different narrative, a couple of different narratives actually. One, not all Black people migrated out of the South to the North or West. Many of these people chose to remain in the rural and agricultural South. Number two, they're not all sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Many of them were, but many of them also own land, particularly in rural Arkansas. And so I just saw the need to really tell some stories that hadn't been told before, particularly in Arkansas history, where when people talk about rurality and agriculture, the discussions are almost always about white folks, and that's fine. But I knew that there was more to that story. And when I started digging, I found all kinds of things that disrupted a lot of the narratives people have long believed about African Americans in rural spaces. And so I just started digging and writing from there and had quite a bit of fun with it actually, because I had to travel to take a look at the Arkansas Agricultural Extension Service records. I had to learn who and what Gene's industrial supervising teachers were. I learned a lot about things like the Arkansas Association of Colored Women, which is affiliated with the National Association of Colored Women and still exists today. As a matter of fact, I'm a member of the organization and have been for a few years. But I wanted to tell stories about Black women who were activists in rural spaces, who came from rural areas, who lived their entire lives in rural spaces. And people told me, oh, you won't find anything, there's no story. And I didn't accept that. And I started digging. And what I did find was absolutely overwhelming. And I had a wonderful time writing this book. I'm also a professor of history and dean of the graduate school at Arkansas State. And on many occasions, I had to remember that those were my primary jobs. But I wanted to tell a story about Black women in Arkansas outside of the Little Rock Central High School crisis, because for many people, that's the story of the state of Arkansas. But I knew that there was something else there to tell. So I started digging and I started looking at records from Atlanta where the Gene's supervisor industrial teachers records are housed. I started reading a lot of old Black newspapers and predominantly white newspapers because many people believe that predominantly white newspapers only reported the negative things about African Americans. And that's true, but that's not entirely true. A lot of times they're talking about Black organizations. They talk a lot about home demonstration agents, Black home demonstration agents, and Black farm agents because we live in an agricultural region, and that kind of conversation is important to people because at the time, African Americans are their most important labor force. So I was able to glean a lot about what people were doing, the kinds of activism Black women were involved in at this point, and really piece the story together to tell a more complicated and detailed story about who these women and who they were. And the cover of the book, if you'll notice here, I just happened to see this in a collection about home demonstration agents in Arkansas at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And they had this one file that was labeled Negro Home Demonstration Agents. And of course, people need to know that the Extension Service all throughout the South was segregated until the 1960s. And the minute I saw that image, I thought to myself, this is going to be the cover of my book. And I had already made up my mind that I wasn't going to ask my editor. I was telling him that this was going to be the cover of my book. And fortunately, he didn't put up a fight against that. But I really deeply explored these women's lives. And at least in a couple of instances, I got to interview at least one woman who was a former home demonstration agent. When I interviewed her about 3 or 4 years ago, she was already 95 years old, and she died shortly after that. So I was really, really very fortunate to be able to get her story. And if you have an opportunity to read the book, the last chapter is about a woman named Annie Zachary Pike. And I always, always, always like to tell this story because it says a lot about rural Black women's lives, number one, but it also speaks to the ways that we have to really be clever about how we locate resources to tell these women's lives. And so Annie Zachary Pike, and again, she's chapter number 12 in this book, she was born in rural Phillips County, Arkansas, and her parents were farmers, agricultural laborers, but Annie Zachary Pike got a chance to go to school. She went to a school called the Consolidated White River Academy in Monroe County, Arkansas. And when I tell that story, it's very interesting to people because many people don't realize that well until at least the 1960s, there were over 100 African-American co-educational boarding schools, and the Consolidated White River Academy just happened to be one of them in Arkansas. Anyway, she goes on to nursing school for a while in St. Louis, returns to Arkansas, and then marries a guy named Grover Zachary Cleveland, who's about 30 years older than her, by the way. So she marries him when she's 30, and he's about 60 or 65 years old. Grover Zachary Cleveland is a substantial African-American landowner in Phillips County, Arkansas. So she becomes the wife of a landowner who has sharecroppers working for them. So this already disrupts that narrative that all Black people are laboring on white-owned land. No, they own their land. Well, Mr. Cleve, as they used to call him, her husband, he becomes ill in about 1960 or so. And so she has to take over the farming operations. And she talks about what it was like to be a young mother trying to get older people who are old enough to be her grandparents in some instances, to learn new farming techniques to make the land more productive, to get more yield from the crop, so on and so forth. She also talks about how she worked very closely with the Black home demonstration agent in that area to learn all of these new ways of farming. But what's really piqued my interest about this story is the fact that this woman also goes on to become involved in Arkansas politics. In particular, she becomes very involved in the Arkansas Republican Party. So this disrupts another narrative about African Americans and politics in the late 1960s and early 1970s. She becomes involved in Republican politics at a time when many African Americans are becoming involved in Democratic politics. And in 1972, she runs for the Arkansas State Senate, the first African American to do so. And she doesn't win, but I have the numbers. She doesn't lose by very much. So I'm going to wrap this up very quickly because I would love to entertain whatever questions you all have. The long and the short of it is that she remains active in Republican Party politics until about the 1970s or so, but she remained a community activist long after that. And she's still very much alive. She's 90 or 91 years old. We talk fairly often. Every time I go down to Phillips, Arkansas, Phillips County, Arkansas, which is about 2 hours south of where I live in Jonesboro, she has more resources for me, most of which are in big bins in her house. I go down there, she cooks all of this wonderful food for me. We sing gospel songs and I scan documents. And none of the information that I've been able to find about this woman's life to help me write this last chapter are in anybody's archives. And so I think that says a lot about the significance of home archives, barn archives, and backroom archives, because that's a lot of what I had to use in order to tell these Black women's stories. So I'm going to stop there. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. I believe you can come off mute to ask if you wish, and I'm happy to answer them. Oh, come now, not all at once.
Good evening. Good evening. This
Good
is
evening.
such an exciting story that you have. It's wonderful that you started talking about the archives, because that was the question that I was going to ask. What happens now to these materials that you have? What is your recommendation in terms of where they go? Who keeps them so that they will be available for other historians and academics to do their research around?
Well, they're still largely at her house in these huge bins. And it's very difficult to go down there and have that conversation about where they're going to go, when whatever happens. But I hope to speak more to her son and say, look, Mr. Zachary, this is really important stuff. Would you consider, for example, donating them to the Arkansas Studies Institute in Little Rock, or would you consider donating them to the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, because their family was a big supporter of that institution, and they have an archives as well. I mean, I think those are two excellent places for those resources to go. But how do you have that? That's a very difficult and delicate conversation to have.
Mm-hmm. I see one of the other questions in the chat is how to get the book. What does it cost? And if someone is interested in having you come and speak about the book or talk to a book club, how do they go about making those arrangements?
Well, you can just email me. In fact, we've got 2 minutes. I just got the notification. You can email me at crjones@astate.edu. And the book is available on Amazon. It's also available at the University of Arkansas Press. That's who published it. I would encourage you to go to University of Arkansas Press, because I believe it's on sale for what, $29.99. Full price is $39.99. So if you're like me at all, you want to save money, that's the route that I would take.
Fantastic. I am not seeing any more questions.
But please feel free to reach out to me via email. I'm very responsive to email.
I can attest to that. Did you find out in terms of not just her family, but other of the families of these Black women, in terms of appreciating the importance of the work that these women had done?
These women were the community leaders. They were the people that people went to when they had issues. Just to give you an example, home demonstration agents in these communities often started home demonstration clubs. These were safe spaces for women generally, regardless of race, but particularly for Black women. And so when people from rural areas now talk about home demonstration clubs, they talk about them in terms of, oh, they canned tomatoes. Well, tomatoes ain't all that interesting. So what I wanted to know is, what else were they talking about? So they're talking about child rearing. They're talking about sex. They're talking about politics. And I found evidence of them having all of these kinds of discussions that other people just overlooked because they just thought they were talking about canning. That's a hot, boring conversation. And these are smart women, regardless of the fact that they're not formally educated. So they're talking about all kinds of other things.
Great. There's a question in the chat to give the title of the book again. And once again, your email address is in the chat, but information on how to purchase the book.
Yes. The book is titled Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Rural Black Women's Activism in Arkansas, 1914 to 1965. And please check it out because we definitely need more books on rural African American history. There's a lot of stuff out there.
There's another question that Jason came up in the chat. Are there others working on other states, the same topic, but in other areas outside of Arkansas?
I know of 2 graduate students who are working on something like this, but the number of people writing this kind of rural Black women's history are woefully few. As a matter of fact, when I go to conferences like the Rural Women's Studies Association, the Agricultural History Society meetings, I'm usually one of 2 or 3 African descended people at these conferences.
Well, we certainly want to support what you're doing. This is very important scholarship. Through the course of this conference, there have been a number of sessions that have been about rural life for Black people, and the challenges that we had. And certainly we're always interested from our perspective on the role that women, Black women had in that. So we applaud you. We want to, someone said, Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps
Yes.
is the name of the book. You can purchase that book. There's also in the chat information that if you text to 41444 and donate $10, your name will be put in a raffle to perhaps win a copy of this book. So we encourage you to do that. I just want to say personally, Dr. Jones Branch, thank you so much for the support that you provide to ASALH, your work on the academic program committee, and wherever we call. So we are just delighted to say thank you to more dedicated ASALH members. And with that being said, if there are no more questions, then we can say good evening.
Good evening, and thank you very much again for your time.